So again, thank you so much. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a very interesting topic for Natixis, the bank I work for. It doesn't mean that I actually am a green finance expert whatsoever, but it's been for a long time already one of our key areas of business in Europe, and undoubtedly I need to talk about Europe when, if there is one thing actually, there's always so many bad news about Europe. For once, we can actually say that, in green finance we've been doing quite a lot, and that's what I want to share with you. Also because beyond the fact that it's actually the largest market in green issuance in the world, it's also about the fact that these are cross-border projects. And I think this brings a lot of possibilities of cooperation with the Greater Bay Area. Because at the end of the day, we need to agree on standards, on ways to do things, and I think a lot can be learned from Europe in that regard. Not that I'm the person to learn from, but I think I can share the big picture on that, and I leave it up to the experts to then follow up with our European partners. So you may say, well, environment is such an issue here. It might not be such a big issue in Europe. Actually, it is a big issue in Europe as well. That's why we've been working on this, and it's a big issue all over the place. So I just wanted to kind of bring that idea that it is, in fact, a global problem, and we know that very well. Now, beyond the actual reason why we're talking about green finance, which is, of course, in itself a whole topic, I'm going to focus on the financing part. So I want to leave that very clear. So I'm going to focus on what has been done in Europe on the financing part. And I think it goes very well into what Christine mentioned of the role of the public sector, to what extent and how to do it. So this is just to show you that Europe is indeed has so far the largest investment in green finance. This is everything, not only green bonds. It's about 10 trillion. So it's very, very big, and this is only increasing. It's, of course, increasing very rapidly in China as well. Now, on this, the key issue here of the private versus public financing. I think we in Europe have this experience of using development banks that I think is very interesting in very different formats, either specifically for green finance, such as the UK. It's a smaller endeavor, but in a way it's more focused. And I think there's a lot to learn from that experience. Or, big way, so Germany, KFB, and, the issues with something that relates actually to European regulations that I'll come back in a minute, or the full-fledged, and I think there's perhaps some embryo of what that could mean for the Greater Bay Area, which is a European level bank, the European Investment Bank. Could the Greater Bay Area think of something of that sort, something that actually provides it capital beyond borders, whatever that might mean for this area? I think that is a very important thing to think about, whether that could be a way to solve cross-border issues, projects that go beyond the border, how to deal with them. So this is the first idea. What about creating a specific public institution with two major shareholders and just bring that further? I need to say, though, that in Europe, and again, this is very different from China. So it might not be a problem for you, but we do have certain limits, if not strong limits, on state aid, which actually limits the role of these banks. Because the minute that something is considered a full subsidy, including in a sector such as green, becomes a problem. But there are also lessons to be learned from that. In fact, we have a number of task forces going on how to exclude that, both, and I'll come back to the private sector in a minute, as far as state aid is concerned, but also as far as the roles of bank finance is concerned. So, of course, public finance, you just have to look at this graph, level of debt in Europe, across countries, we can't afford it. We're talking about, I was looking at the numbers, and we always kind of, sorry to say, freak out when we look at BRI financing needs, from the famous ADB report to 26 trillion to 8 trillion CGP. Well, actually, this is of this size, only for Europe. So we're talking about massive amounts of financing needed. We can't do it only on the public sector. I'll be brief. So what about the banking sector? So we move to the private sector, banking sector. Obviously, with the current regulatory environment, you just can't even think about it. It's just too expensive in terms of capital needs. So now there's a lot of discussion. There's an action plan released by the European Commission on a high-level working group on how to perhaps treat green versus brown differently in terms of capital requirements. So I think this is one more thing to think about for this part of the world. Of course, there's also a major endeavor at the global level with the FSB, but I'm just thinking maybe you need to treat it separately, you know, as a region, rather than just wait for FSB to react to this. It might be easier. Now, the other thing is, of course, the massive thing is bond finance, since the banks are kind of straitjacket on this. And this is our green finance team providing you with some flavor of who is issuing, because I just wanted to mention that, yes, of course, the public sector is important, also the issuance size, let alone, you know, international organizations and so on, but also corporates themselves are starting to use green finance as a wonderful tool. Why? Because they can think of special or, you know, buyers that would be interested. Think about pension funds. So the idea that this is not only a public endeavor for the environment, but actually a nice tool to use to issue and to raise funding for any corporate in the world, let alone financial institutions. So these are the largest issues of, including municipalities, except for the US. So it's very big in Europe, as I mentioned. This is China. Same idea. You already have the corporates there. So it's not only like, you know, I don't know, the World Bank or you name it. It's already becoming a market instrument. But very, very quickly, I see signs, rush, so I will rush. The maturity. I think this is very important. We're talking about issuing bonds for two reasons. First, banks are straitjacket. Second, we need long-term finance. That's the whole point. And frankly speaking, the average maturity of any bond issued, even offshore, but especially onshore, is just too short. So this is a key issue to basically tackle in this part of the world compared to global average. This is just green finance. But I could argue that this is true beyond green finance. And then you need the buyers of this. I mean, you need somebody to basically have in mind that they want more of this type of product so that it makes market sense. And I think pension funds, of course, lifers, are the market to be developed. Of course, on the lifer part of the story in Asia, we have a better outlook than when I just showed you there, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and of course, increasingly China. But on the pension fund, we're not yet there. And I think this is very important to kind of think of who is the buyer behind this long-term paper that has these special characteristics. So I promised I would say something about cross-border projects. I don't have any more time, but here are some examples of cross-border projects in Europe, which I wanted just to bring to time's up. So to you as a reference that lessons can be learned from these projects, because there are particular difficulties when you need to deal with different standards at the different, if not national, at least standard level, yeah, which could be the case of the Greater Bay Area. So I leave it here. Thank you very much for your time.